Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Hoteps and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support us here at Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, June 8th, 2024. We begin with our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne, who's going to be joined on the line by Paula Marie Seniors, associate professor of Africana Studies at Virginia Tech, and author of the book Mae Mallory, The Monroe Defense Committee and World Revolution, African American Women Radical Activists. Then, in the second half of our show, we'll be hearing from Woody Holton, professor of history at the University of South Carolina. He'll be joining Dr. Horne on the line to discuss his recent article in the American Historical Review entitled Chilling Effects: The Far Right Takes Aim at Black History. It'll be yet another informative and enlightening morning for you listeners right here on KPFK. Now, while we are in Fund Drive and still able to bring you this much quality content, we want to remind you to please support our efforts here at KPFK. So let's hear from the Sultan of Study himself, Dr. Gerald Horne, with a message for those who can't get enough of Freedom Now.
Pledge a mere $100 and receive as a thank you gift the latest book from Gerald Horne, hot off the presses, Armed Struggle: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Read about the distinctions drawn between and amongst armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. Read the first detailed analysis of the shootout at the UCLA campus in January 1969, leaving 2 Panthers dead. Read the first detailed analysis of the LAPD attack on Panther headquarters in December 1969. Read the first detailed analysis of the August 1970 shootout at the Marin County Courthouse, featuring Pasadena teenager Jonathan Jackson in an alleged attempt to free his elder brother, George Jackson, and read of the role of the recently deceased political prisoner, Ruchell McGee. Read the first detailed analysis of the attempt at UCLA to fire Professor Angela Davis because of her membership in the U.S. Communist Party and her subsequent trial when she was charged with murder, conspiracy, and kidnapping during the aforementioned county courthouse shootout. Read the first detailed analysis of the Panthers' embassy abroad in Algeria, led by Eldridge Cleaver of Pasadena and Watts, in their attempt to build global solidarity for the Black liberation struggle. Read of the Panthers' solidarity delegations to the nation then known as the People's Republic of the Congo in Brazzaville, and of the Panthers' exile in socialist Cuba. Read of the connections between Hollywood communists and progressives, such as screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, actor Jane Fonda, actor Gene Seberg, screenwriter Donald Freed, basketball star Bill Walton, and producer Bert Schneider, and their support for the Panthers. Read of the severe repression visited upon radical and left-wing forces, which set the stage for the rise of paramilitary forces, often depicted as gangs, and the concomitant rise of the drug epidemic, especially crack cocaine. Read the first detailed analysis of the NAACP chapter in LA, especially the Beverly Hills Hollywood branch, which was a cash cow for the national organization, not least because of the contributions from celebrities like Sammy Davis Jr. Read of the roots of Kwanzaa, the nationally celebrated Black American holiday. Above all, understand why historically Southern California has been in the vanguard of radicalism and revolutionary upsurges, and how that spirit has yet to be squashed. Again, pledge a mere $100 and receive a signed copy of the latest book by Gerald Horne, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Make your pledge and support our efforts here at Freedom Now. Of course, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Pete Rock, Carl Latham, the Marsalis family, Dina D. Rose, Thelonious Monk, and Wes Montgomery. Now, people, get ready for this train to come in, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Paula Marie Seniors.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Paula Marie Seniors, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Virginia Tech and author of the book Mae Mallory, The Monroe Defense Committee and World Revolutions, African American Women Radical Activists. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Radio, Professor Seniors.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So who was Mae Mallory, and why did you decide to write a book that features her?
Mae Mallory was an African-American woman born in Macon, Georgia in 1927. At the age of 3, a white woman accused her of hitting her, and the police came to arrest her. And her cousin let them know that they were not going to allow this to happen. So her cousin gave her the first lesson in self-defense. The cousin let it out to the police officers that she was not going to have them behave in this way, and that Mae was not going to apologize to the white woman who accused her of hitting her. So that was her first lesson. Mae Mallory moved to New York City. At the age of 17, she had an arranged marriage to Kiefer Mallory. She had her daughter that same year, in 2000, at the age of 18, she had her son 3 months. She became pregnant. 3 months after she gave birth to her daughter. She felt that there was more to just being a mother. And so she joined various organizations, including the Communist Party of USA. She organized an organization called the Crusaders, the Crusaders family, in support of Robert F. Williams, Mrs. Ethel Azalea Johnson, and Dr. Perry, who had founded the Negroes with Guns movement in Monroe, North Carolina.
And I take it that when I ask you this second question, who was Audrey Proctor Seniors, it may shed light on the first question, which is, why did you decide to write this book?
Yes. So what occurred, I'll just try to go in a normal pattern. What occurred was Mae Mallory so invested in the Negroes with Guns movement. In 1961, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Martin Luther King Jr., and folks of that ilk decided that they were going to go to Monroe, North Carolina, and teach the Negroes with Guns the effectiveness of passive resistance. Robert F. Williams wrote to his friends, including Mae Mallory, who had fundraisers to help buy weapons for the Negroes with Guns movement. She also had received 2 machine guns from a Harlem gangster. And so he wrote to his friends because he knew it wasn't going to go well with the nonviolent people coming to Monroe, to come and support him. So Mae Mallory drove to Monroe, North Carolina with the guns to aid Robert F. Williams. The Negroes with Guns movement told them, do not march on Sunday. And of course, because they felt they knew more, they marched on Sunday. They were brutally beaten. According to Southern custom, they were arrested. And what occurred was a Ku Klux Klan couple drove into the Black community. Mae Mallory said she did not involve herself with the marches because she believed in self-defense. So this Ku Klux Klan couple drove into the African American community, and the African Americans were very angered by this. So to gain protection, they went into Robert F. Williams' home. Robert F. Williams, his wife, Maybelle Williams, and Mae Mallory protected these Ku Klux Klansmen. When it was clear for them to leave, they left. Upon their leaving, the Chief Monty, the chief of police, called and told them that they would all be hanging by the evening. Robert F. Williams, Mae Mallory made their way to New York. He told Mae that she could not go with him any further than New York. He and his family made their way to Cuba. Mae Mallory said that in New York, when she saw they were all accused of kidnapping this Ku Klux Klan couple, she made her way to Cleveland, Ohio. She hid out pretty well until her family told the FBI where she was. And so they grabbed her up real quick and put her in jail, and she was accused of kidnapping this Ku Klux Klan couple. Robert Williams and his family were in Cuba. So my mother, Audrey Proctor Seniors, and others founded what they called the Monroe Defense Committee to prevent Mae Mallory from being extradited to Monroe on this kidnapping charge. And so my mother was involved in that. And so my mother, Audrey Proctor Seniors, was born at Charity Hospital in New Orleans. And her first act of activism was by joining the Radical National Association Advancement of Colored People in New Orleans. They had been banned 10 years before she joined. And she joined this organization where she met people who were communists. She met people who belonged to unions. And there, she wanted to leave New Orleans, excuse me, and her parents would not let her move until she was 21. So she moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and stayed with her aunt, and became involved with the Monroe Defense Committee to prevent Mae from being extradited to Monroe, North Carolina.
Now, in your previous remarks, you indicated that a Harlem gangster provided Mae Mallory and her comrades with weapons. By any chance, was that Bumpy Johnson?
I don't know who it was. They did not say. My father did not mention the person's name, so I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Now, what is or was the Workers' World Party, and what role does it play in your pages?
Okay, so the Workers' World Party was initially, these were initially working class members of the Socialist Workers' Party in Buffalo, New York. They became disgruntled with the Socialist Workers' Party, who supported Stalin and some of these other people, and they founded the Workers' World Party. My father was a founding member of that organization. They were Trotskyist and Maoist. And they also had the Youth Against War and Fascism, which my mother was involved with it. She was the member of that, as well as a member of the Workers' World Party. So what happened was my father went and became the chairman of the Monroe Defense Committee after the group had been attacked by some Black nationalists and beaten up.
Why were they attacked by Black nationalists?
They felt that it should only be a Black organization. I surmise that they probably were agent provocateurs of the FBI to rattle the organization, to try to get it to dismantle.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned previously Ethel Azalea Johnson. Could you elaborate on her and her role?
Yes. So Ethel Azalea Johnson was the lone woman she was the lone woman of the Negroes with Guns movement. She came from South Carolina, Abbeville, South Carolina, a historical community of struggle and resistance. And so she learned early in life the importance of self-defense. She moved to Monroe, North Carolina in 1947, married, had a son. And when the Negroes with Guns movement, which was previously the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, when they were founded, she was one of the founding members. The Negroes with Guns movement came out of the National Association of Advancement of Colored People in Monroe, North Carolina, because the women demanded that something be done about the abhorrent behavior of the Klan and the white people of Monroe, North Carolina. So there were 3 cases that made them do this. There was the kissing case, where 2 little boys were accused of the little white girl kissed one of the little boys, and they were accused of rape. That was the first case. The second and third case were a rape of an African-American woman and another African-American woman who was thrown down a flight of stairs at the hotel in which she worked. So the national NAACP would not get involved. So the women were brave enough to bring a case against these white rapists and abusers. And during that historical time period, they lost the case. And because the case was lost, the African-American women in Monroe demanded that something be done. And that was the foundation of the Negroes with Guns movement, to carry arms and protect women and children.
Now, how was the kissing case resolved with this little white girl apparently in controversy with a little black boy?
Yeah, it was terrible. So the little boys, they spent many months in jail. The National Association would not get involved. The North Carolina Association would not get involved. So it became an international case that Robert F. Williams and Mrs. Ethel Azalea Johnson and Dr. Perry promoted. And so that's how the little boys were able to get out of jail, and their parents promptly moved them to Charlotte, North Carolina.
And as I understand it, Robert F. Williams, when he wound up in Cuba, he started what was called Radio Free Dixie to broadcast back into the United States with music, with political messages, etc. Is it fair to assume that Mae Mallory or Audrey Proctor Seniors or Ethel Azalea Johnson were involved in that project?
No, what occurred was he never spoke out about Mae Mallory being in jail. So my mother wrote him a letter, basically castigating him, about, they were following him in the Negroes with Guns movement, and he was doing nothing for Mae Mallory. So eventually he did become involved and write several articles in the Crusader about Mae Mallory, calling for her to be released from jail. But initially he was not involved. Now, this could have been the case of the agent provocateurs harassing him in Cuba. He and Mae Mallory had a contentious relationship where, he at some points in his life accused her of being an agent. They were not involved with the Radio Free Dixie.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also talk in your book, Professor Seniors, about Tanzania, Nicaragua, and Grenada. What do you say about these three countries and their revolutionary and anti-colonial processes?
So these women were, radical activists. So what occurred was Pat Mallory, Mae's daughter, first went to Guyana to look at this revolution. And she went under the auspices of the African Society of Cultural Relations with Independent Africa. So she spent time there. When she heard about the Tanzanian Revolution, which occurred in 1961, and it was an African socialist revolution, she wanted to take part. And so as what occurred was the Tanzanian government reached out to African-American activists and invited them to come to Tanzania to help build the country. So Pat Mallory, initially she and her friends from Stony Brook went on a visit to Tanzania. And then she went back she was finishing her graduate degree in education from New York University, and she went back to Tanzania. She said that her mother was itching to get to Tanzania as well. So her mother, Mae Mallory, eventually made her way to Tanzania. So Pat Mallory taught at one of the former Marinol sisters schools in Tanzania for about 5 years. And Mae Mallory and her mother worked as well. What occurred was COINTELPRO got into Tanzania and made these stories about African Americans being spies in Tanzania. So although they wanted to stay, it was called the Big Bust, where many of the African Americans left Tanzania, and Pat Mallory and her mother and grandmother eventually had to leave as well. With Grenada and Nicaragua, my mother wanted to be involved in socialist revolutions. She was very disappointed with the civil rights movement, how it turned out, leaving the working class and poor behind in terrible living conditions, not seeing the civil rights movement raise up everybody except for the elite Blacks. So she initially went to Grenada for that socialist revolution there. When she got back, the American government went in and overthrew the government. Maurice Bishop, his and others who were part of this New Jewel movement were murdered. And so she came back home, and she was very distressed. She was not there when that occurred. but she was very distressed that this occurred. So she created with others 3 organizations to support the Grenadians in terms of the American invasion. She then went to Nicaragua for that Sandinista revolution and picked coffee for the Sandinistas in a situation where they were being attacked by the right-wing organizations in Nicaragua. So she went there to Nicaragua and spent time there picking coffee for the Sandinistas. And that eventually ended because they were so successful with that activism.
Now,
so then,
I'm sorry.
Go
Go ahead, please.
So then she also involved herself with the apartheid movement, and she went to Namibia and was a viewer of them gaining independence from South Africa.
Now, I take it that these 3 African-American women radical activists that we focused on thus far, Mae Mallory, Audrey Proctor Seniors, and Ethel Azalea Johnson, are no longer in the land of the living. What can you tell us about how they spent their latter years?
Okay, so Pat Mallory, you forgot Pat. Pat Mallory came back to the United States and she became a teacher. And Mrs. Ethel Azalea Johnson, because she was unable to go to Cuba, the U.S. government prevented her to go to Cuba. She formed different organizations in Monroe, North Carolina, such as the Head Start program, a preschool program, as well as a citizenship school program. And she ran these programs successfully and was very successful with that. She never felt that she could not work with others who were not self-defense advocates. So she was able to get those programs going. Mae Mallory came back to the United States and lived her life as an activist. There's a young lady, Yi Fung, who's written her master's thesis. And she admired Mae Mallory so much when Mae Mallory became a social worker that she has moved into that profession as well. My mother, as I said, she went to Namibia for that, to be an observer of that freedom from South Africa. She continued her protest until the day she died. So her last year was quite unfortunate. She worked for the Center Center for Constitutional Rights, and she had worked there for many years. And they fired her and took away her health insurance. My mother had kidney disease, and so to our surprise and great admiration, the members of the Center for Constitutional Rights went out in protest when they did this to my mother. They eventually won the case, and she was eventually, rehired. But, you don't want to work in an environment where they're hostile to you. So she retired. And that summer, 1995, she died.
Finally, Professor Seniors, author of the book, Mae Mallory, the Monroe Defense Committee and World Revolutions, African-American Women Radical Activists. What's next on your research agenda?
I have 2 books I'm working on right now. The first one is about African-American women and girls, their abuse by the police state. I'm looking at that. And I also look at their abuse during the COVID situation, as well as January 6th. That's one of the projects I'm working on. The other project I'm working on is quite different. It's about the opera by Scott Joplin called Treemonisha, and its premiere in 1972 and what happened after that. So those are my 2 books that I'm working on now.
Well, we look forward with eager participation to those next publications. Professor Seniors, Associate Professor of African Studies at Virginia Tech, thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so very much.
Special thanks to Professor Seniors for sharing her work with us. Where else can you get such quality content, context, and historical perspective other than Freedom Now? So, Dr. Horne, talk to the people a bit about the importance of supporting the show and the station.
Pledge a mere $100 and receive as a thank you gift the latest book from Gerald Horne, hot off the presses, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Read about the distinctions drawn between and amongst armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. Read the first detailed analysis of the shootout at the UCLA campus in January 1969, leaving 2 Panthers dead. Read the first detailed analysis of the LAPD attack on Panther headquarters in December 1969. Read the first detailed analysis of the August 1970 shootout at the Marin County Courthouse, featuring Pasadena teenager Jonathan Jackson in an alleged attempt to free his elder brother, George Jackson, and read of the role of the recently deceased political prisoner, Ruchell Magee. Read the first detailed analysis of the attempt at UCLA to fire Professor Angela Davis because of her membership in the U.S. Communist Party and her subsequent trial when she was charged with murder, conspiracy, and kidnapping during the aforementioned county courthouse shootout. Read the first detailed analysis of the Panthers' embassy abroad in Algeria, led by Eldridge Cleaver of Pasadena and Watts, and their attempt to build global solidarity for the Black liberation struggle. Read of the Panthers' solidarity delegations to the nation then known as the People's Republic of the Congo in Brazzaville, and of the Panthers' exile in socialist Cuba. Read of the connections between Hollywood communists and progressives, such as screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, actor Jane Fonda, actor Gene Seberg, screenwriter Donald Freed, basketball star Bill Walton, and producer Bert Schneider, and their support for the Panthers. Read of the severe repression visited upon radical and left-wing forces, which set the stage for the rise of paramilitary forces, often depicted as gangs, and the concomitant rise of the drug epidemic, especially crack cocaine. Read the first detailed analysis of the NAACP chapter in LA, especially the Beverly Hills Hollywood branch, which was a cash cow for the national organization, not least because of the contributions from celebrities like Sammy Davis Jr. Read of the roots of Kwanzaa, the nationally celebrated Black American holiday. Above all, understand why historically Southern California has been in the vanguard of radicalism and revolutionary upsurges, and how that spirit has yet to be squashed. Again, pledge a mere $100 and receive a signed copy of the latest book by Gerald Horne, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate right now and make your support for the show and the station felt. Now, getting right back into it, we're going to send you back off to Dr. Horne, who's now being joined on the line by Woody Holton.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Woody Holton, professor of history at the University of South Carolina, and for our purposes here, author of an article in the Current American Historical Review entitled Chilling Affects: The Far Right Takes Aim at Black History. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Holton.
I thank you. I'm a Pacifica fan, so I'm really glad to be here with you.
Oh, and we're glad to have you. So why did you write this article?
Because I was frankly distressed to see that there's literally a war against Black history going on, not carried out by students, certainly, and really not very much by parents, but by politicians who I see as finding an issue that works. I'm from Virginia. My father was a Republican politician, but he was a Lincoln Republican politician, which means he was against things like Jim Crow, segregation. And the expression they had was, when a politician gets in trouble, they push the black button. It's sort of like the emergency button, only it wasn't red, it was black. And that is, if you're losing an election, you stir up white folks' fears of black folks. And I think that's what's happening in our classrooms now. And it's resulting in just real tragic things like kids being banned from reading a book called Ruby Bridges Goes to School. This would be for small kids, although I liked it, and I'm not a small kid. And it's the autobiography of the woman who desegregated the New Orleans schools as a 6-year-old child. And it's a beautiful, touching book, and it's been taken away from kids in a number of jurisdictions on the theory that it's something called critical race theory.
Mm. Now, just to clarify, your father was not just a Republican politician. He was the governor of Virginia during the era of desegregation, which gave you a front row seat during a very tumultuous period. Which brings me to the 1619 Project of Nicole Hannah-Jones, now of Howard University, which seeks to, in many ways, rewrite the origin story of the United States of America. Apparently, that has inflamed many politicians. Why so?
Well, here's an optimistic way to put it. They wouldn't be trying to shut us up if no one was listening to us. And so I think Black history is only one of the fields that I'm interested in. I write women's history, Native American history, basic political history, and so forth. But no one's trying to ban those other ones. And so the fact that people are coming after Black history, I think, tells me that something is happening. And you can see that, for instance, in the incredible popularity of the 1619 Project, first as a special issue of the New York Times Magazine. I think it sold better than any previous special issue of that magazine. And then as an author, and I'm sure you feel the same way, as a slightly more popular author than me, we were envious because that book stayed at the top of the bestseller list for months and is still way up there now. And so had this been a sort of classic academic title where, you sell 3,000 copies and you're happy with that, we would never have had a controversy about it. The 1619 Project struck a nerve because it worked.
And it worked in part because it seeks to elevate the role of enslavement of Africans in terms of the creation of the United States of America. That seemed to irritate quite a number of politicians. And I understand that there have been laws passed against the teaching of Nicole Hannah-Jones' handiwork. Is that accurate?
Yeah, 2 of the 4 largest states in the country are Florida and Texas. And I have a couple of kids in high school, and if we lived just 2 states further south, I'm in South Carolina, but if we were in Florida, and my kid's teacher brought the 1619 book to class and read maybe 1 paragraph from it, and then 5 paragraphs of criticism of it, that teacher could get fired. Maybe they'd get a warning the first time, they'd ultimately get fired, and teachers have been fired. So we've got 2 states where it's state law that book cannot be used in the classroom, even in the context of its critics. And then in a way, that's the 2 largest states, but in a way, what's more pernicious is all these local school boards, because there's, I'm not sure how many, but something like 10,000 jurisdictions out there, independent school districts. And so it's a lot harder to snuff it out when it's hiding in all these nooks and crannies than when it's plain to see in 2 states, and also the 1619, I only mentioned Florida and Texas because it's named in the legislation. That book, you know you're in trouble when you're actually naming books to be banned. But they more broadly blame what they call critical race theory, which is basically Black history. There are more broad bans on that have been used against 1619 Project, as well as books like Ruby Bridges Goes to School in other states as well.
So in the interest of full disclosure, we should mention that as part of the television series of the 1619 Project, that you were featured. I recall you're sitting on a bench, if I'm not mistaken, in Williamsburg, Virginia, discussing the question of slavery with Nicole Hannah-Jones. Refresh our recollection about that.
Yeah, that was a great moment for me. I've been a fan of Nicole Hannah-Jones's through this project and other things, like she's lives in Brooklyn and sends her kid to the local public school. She could afford to send her to the best school in the country, or the best private, boarding school in the country. She chose, hey, I want my kid to go to the local public school. My parents did me that favor too, but she did that, and as we have for our kids. But not everybody who has that opportunity in a place like Brooklyn. A lot of people are scared. What's going to happen to my kid in this local public school? And she does that. Anyway, I had a lot of reasons to admire her, and I was prepared to be intimidated by her, but she was very easy to talk to. And they were doing a 6-part series version, a movie version of the 1619 Project on Hulu. And as you say, I got to fully disclose I'm in it, so I'm biased. Never been on Hulu before. I'm sure I never will be since. But I think if you look at the 6 parts, they did a very good job, and they kind of moved the ball further down the field even than they had in the book and the magazine version. So I think it's terrific. My particular role, it arose actually. They had initially called me as a fact checker for the book version, because the magazine version had taken all this criticism and people saying on the floor of the U.S. Senate, for instance, oh, it's just full of inaccuracies. And there were a couple of small errors in it, as there is in anything like that. I wish I could say I've published 6 books. I wish I could say, well, there's just one that has no mistakes, but that's pretty much impossible. But here's the point. No one's really gone nuts about the mistakes in my book, or you can tell me about you, whether you've had that experience. But this book did, because it's so famous. People combed through it. People were hired, research staff. Oh, I found another one, but tiny little things, of off by a year or whatever. Anyway, so they decided for the book version, that was the magazine version that got all that criticism. So the book version, we're gonna just fact check it to death. And I was one of the people. I remember sitting on another bench. My wife, we were visiting her family in Mississippi, and I sat there on a bench, and they walked me through everything she wanted to say about my topic, and said, err on the side of caution, because we don't want to err at all. And I really will say that the book, because of all that fact checking, is something you could really swear on. Much more than most history books by the people criticizing it, for instance. So I think it's terrific. And then out of my fact checker role, Nicole invited me to Colonial Williamsburg to talk about the role of enslaved people in the Revolution, which turned out to be huge. That town where we were sitting, everybody has just about heard of Colonial Williamsburg, at least on my coast. And the reality is that 50% of Williamsburg was enslaved, 40% of the colony of Virginia, the largest colony. And to narrow it down very briefly, enslaved people in the colony of Virginia made an alliance with the British starting in the fall of 1774, a year before it was officially turned into an Emancipation Proclamation. But that last royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, he did, at the instigation of African Americans, he issued an Emancipation Proclamation saying, if you will come fight on my side, African Americans who are owned by people like Jefferson and Washington, then I will free you. Now, he did not do that out of any kind of humanitarian instinct. He had slaves himself, and he wasn't planning to free all of them. He needed workers. He needed labor. He needed fighters. And there were very few whites on his side in Virginia. And so out of desperation, he appealed to blacks. So I don't think he deserves a statue or anything because he was just trying to get by. But who does deserve a statue, I think, are the thousands of African Americans who joined him and fought on the British side to get free. Now, to be honest and fair, we should say that up north, lots of African Americans fought on the American side and got their freedom that way. Sometimes they had to then sue to get the promise to be kept, but you had something like 10,000 fight on the American side up north. But of course, 90% of African Americans lived in the South, and there was no offer of freedom from the United States, from the rebels, as they were called. If you wanted to get free, you had to fight on the British side. And I think we should celebrate both sides because they obtained something much greater from the revolution than, say, George Washington did. He got out of having to pay taxes to Parliament where he wasn't represented. And that's a big deal. No need to diminish that. But the hundreds of people owned by people like Washington and Jefferson, I should say thousands, because he lost slaves to Governor Dunmore, Jefferson, Patrick Henry, almost everybody you can name who was one of those big Southerners in the Revolution. Here in my current state, Henry Laurens did, and others. My point is, they got something much bigger out of the Revolution, African Americans did, than whites did, because whites got away from taxation without representation, but blacks got away from those whites who were holding them in slavery.
I guess that there is a felt need, left, right, and center, to seem to have all of current U.S. nationals on the same page. And when you begin to talk about how Black people in Virginia were not on board with the revolt against London, obviously we're not all on the same page. And I think that leads to the kinds of legislative reactions that you've articulated with regard to Florida and Texas, for example, which brings me to this point. What are so-called anti-white guilt laws? Because it's suggested that teaching certain kinds of Black history makes little Johnny feel badly, perhaps even need therapy.
Yeah, that would anti-white guilt laws would be a much better name for it. I ended up referring to the people promoting these legislation as fragilists. That is, people who make the case that white kids are fragile and need protection. And of course, I was one of those white kids many years ago, and it would have been a big insult to me to tell me that I had to be insulated from the truth because you can't handle the truth. But that's basically what these politicians are saying to white kids is, you can't handle the truth and we're going to spare you from it. I wish they would protect those same white kids along with Black kids and other kids from things like gun violence, but they've chosen instead to protect them from the truth. And this is why people think it's a typo in the title, because I was talking about not chilling effects. We all know about chilling effects when you ban a newspaper from printing a truth, or a publisher or a book from getting in to students' hands. That's a chilling effect. But I was trying to be clever by saying chilling affects, in that it's all about the affect, the emotion. We're not saving anything from a real danger like gun violence or from COVID. We're protecting people from feeling bad, and we're seeing this now with the demonstrations on campus against the continued Israeli attacks on Gaza. And of course, it is accurate and important to say that October 7th was a horror. But when the students are mentioning these new horrors, we're hearing from politicians, kids are being made to feel uncomfortable on college campuses. Now, we're all against kids being singled out for their race or their creed on college campuses, but feeling uncomfortable on college campuses is exactly how you should feel. If you're sitting on a college campus by a palm tree on a beach, then you're not really in college. You're welcome to have that as your Zoom background, but the reality of college should be and mine often was, because my politics changed a lot. For instance, during college, a lot of my attitudes changed during college, and it's very sad to see politicians saying, "Oh, we've got to now save college kids as well as K through 12 kids from discomfort."
Now, apparently, educators are being threatened. Some are losing their jobs. Librarians are being threatened. Some are losing their jobs. Talk to us about the impact of Black history there.
Yeah, there are lots of examples of that. And it's come fairly close to me. I will say we don't have a ban at the college level here in South Carolina, but I've been teaching for more than 30 years and did that without ever having a student or a parent complain about a book that I required my students to read until I signed the 1619 Project. And then I did get an email from a parent saying, what are you doing assigning that book? Because the parent had been misinformed that it was a bunch of lies, that it was anti-white, which nothing could be further from the truth. Even more so than the magazine version, the book version celebrates the so-called white saviors, doesn't use that term. I think one reason, by the way, Gerald, that they didn't like the 1619 Project, especially the magazine version, is it was not kind to white saviors. Like, take Abraham Lincoln. On the one hand, you can say he's the guy who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. On the other hand, you can actually read the Emancipation Proclamation and see that he said in there, yes, we are going to free the slaves, only the ones in rebel hands that we have no control over. We're going to free the slaves, and we're going to ship them off, maybe to Africa or maybe west of Mississippi. He wasn't clear about where, but he was going to expel them from the country for their crime of being black and free. And so my point is, talking about white saviors, they did okay in the 1619 Project. They didn't do as well as they've done in other books that give them full credit and no credit to the slaves themselves for forcing the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 on him, which a lot of historians argue happened. So I've forgotten your question.
Well, James Whitfield, for example.
Yeah. One of the people. Yeah, he was a principal, African-American principal, independent school district in Texas, who, and it's not like he even assigned the 1619 Project. There had been racist incidents. Everybody agreed they were racist incidents in his school, and he put out an announcement, we've got to stand against this, and that was enough to get him fired. And really this thing has targeted, there had been teachers who'd been fired, but more it's been principals and assistant principals, especially African-American ones. And I think you could go down the list and find white principals who said exactly the same things, combated after racial incidents or whatever, but they haven't been fired, at least not on the same level. And then the other group that's really been targeted have been librarians. And some of it's been short of firing them, but just really disgusting stuff. Librarians accused of being pedophiles because they assigned books. This gets a little bit from the topic of Black history, but sort of the other group that they've gone after are LGBTQA authors who write about LGBTQA subjects. So, for instance, the famous book about the two male penguins who raise an egg into being a penguin together, which is, yes, it's meant to make us people who don't identify as LGBTQA not hate people who do. And so that's seen as promoting this lifestyle and turning the kids gay and so forth. So that book has to go. And then when the librarians say stand up for the books, and lots of them have, by the way, I think part of the story that I told in my article and that others have told too is the amazing heroics of administrators and teachers. And there's groups of kids in some of these high schools, for instance, African-American kids who formed their own book group. Who's ever heard of a high school kid who's reading more than they have to read, not less than they're supposed to read for school? But they did that so they could get access to this. So my point is, that this controversy has created heroes, and I would really especially say those librarians who are accused of being pedophiles and so forth. But it's obviously generated villains as well. But that's who we should be building monuments, I think, to is the kick-ass librarians. One of these women who was accused of being a pedophile in Louisiana has sued the people who did that, and I sure hope she collects, because she's been through hell, as have lots of other librarians. And I want to say one other thing about that. Even those who don't get fired or even disciplined are massively affected by these anti-white guilt laws, because the threat of facing something like termination has a chilling effect, now spelling it with an E, on people. And so, for instance, I have a grad student of mine who was teaching in Virginia and was told by, the assistant principal got him together and said, if a student asks you about the 1619 project, walk away. And so that's how a law, we think about how many people got prosecuted under this law, how many people were convicted. That's not who's being affected by that law. That's the tip of the iceberg. It's all the other people who are made aware of the law and who it changes their behavior. Obviously, sometimes in a good way. People don't speed more than we already do. But in this case, where we have a book that threatens teachers with being fired if they assign Black history, there's this silent, the rest of the iceberg effect, where they're not putting those books in front of the kids.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Holton, author of the article in the Current American Historical Review entitled Chilling Affects: The Far Right Takes Aim at Black History. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Paula Marie Seniors, coming to us from Virginia Tech. Find that Black-owned bookstore near you and get a copy of her book, Mae Mallory, The Monroe Defense Committee and World Revolution, African American Women Radical Activists. Next, we thank Professor Woody Holton from the University of South Carolina for joining us today. Subscribe to the American Historical Review today and read his latest article, Chilling Affects: The Far Right Takes Aim at Black History. We send yet another thank you to Prison Radio and Baba Mumia Abu Jamal for keeping us informed and keeping our eyes and ears on the global struggle for freedom. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder Baba Didan Kamati. Shout out to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.